It's time for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 3 years has shared with us her decades' research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative and judicial processes in America. And now, here's Mae.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Dialogue Conspiracy number 214, and it's September the 15th, 1975. The purpose of dating these programs, as I might have mentioned before, is for several purposes. One is for collectors who make tape cassettes and reels of these shows, and the other purpose is that you can look back 2 or 3 years from now and date the time that we talked about certain matters which appear in the establishment newspaper. I call it the establishment newspaper years later, but which have meaning now, and you can date back the date that we were talking about these matters. Conspiracies and assassinations are very much in the news again this week, and they will be continuously in the news as we get closer to the elections of 1976. It's inevitable that as the power is up for grabs in the White House, that bullets once again will determine our choice of candidates. They have since 1960, in the early 1956, as a matter of fact, which was the last election that wasn't affected by bullets. And that's when Eisenhower was elected president. After that, John Kennedy was killed. Robert Kennedy was killed. Wallace was shot. Mary Jo Kopechne was murdered. And all of these crimes and violence had to do with winning the election and keeping certain people in control of the White House. The continuation of the conspiracy, or the famous no conspiracy scare, will never end until each and every murder is researched by various private investigators and becomes exposed publicly and as quickly as possible. In my Realist article, July 11th, 1972, I said that if we didn't get to the heart and the cause of the Watergate affair, we were headed towards a police state and Gestapo similar to Nazi Germany, and that the secret was in the political assassinations. And unfortunately, the Justice Department never did investigate the Watergate properly. They never handled the planned violence for the Miami Convention, the attempted murder plans for Richard Nixon that involved Andrew Topping in New York. The investigation of the injection of Martha Mitchell has been ignored. The links of E. Howard Hunt and Donald Segretti to the secret army organization in California was ignored, and the links of E. Howard Hunt and James McCord to the Los Angeles Police Department has not been investigated, nor has the Howard Hughes, B.B. Rebozo links to the White House and money to Rosemary Woods, Tony Lasowitz, and John Caulfield. And then there's the endless murders of the Watergate, such as Dorothy Hunt and Lee Pennington, Lou Russell, Sam Giancana, Mary Jo Kopechne, J. Edgar Hoover, the shooting of Wallace, the endless amount of murders, the injection of drugs, the planned violence was very much evidence in Watergate. The evidence exists today, and it's a very important stepping stone to the next stage that was planned in 1972. Had the Watergate people not been caught, the next stage was terrorism in America. And of course, Black Abductor, that book that was published in San Diego, was the script for America's first political kidnapping, which was Patty Hearst. The author of the Black Abductor and the publisher have not been properly identified or recognized, and now we see the use of the Manson family that preceded the SLA. And I have alleged all along and continuously that these are domestic counterintelligence identical to the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia, and that the links to the political assassinations to the Manson family and the creation of the SLA, the funding and the actual tactical support is so strong. But if we don't, and we didn't investigate Watergate, we have given these people free rein to continue with the terrorism that will be taking place in our cities and the streets, and it's prevalent everywhere. I spoke last week about the Manson family and Lynette Fromm, nicknamed Squeaky, and the so-called assassination attempt up in Sacramento. But I want to go back and clarify it a little bit more. It's a week later. I want to talk about it. I spent 2 hours yesterday talking with Sandra Good. She's a roommate of Squeaky, Lynette Fromm, and we had a long conversation on the telephone. She said she would come down here and be a guest at KLRB. She claims the news media distorts the Manson family, turns around their objectives and their motives, and she would like a forum in which to talk. And so I've invited her to come to KLRB. That does not mean I condone the violence or the killings or what went down in Los Angeles, but not condoning violence of one kind does not mean you have to have a double standard and condone violence of another kind. Mr. William Colby, the head of our CIA, admitted at his hearings when he became the head of the CIA that he was responsible for between 20,000 and 40,000 murders that were not prisoners of war, particularly they were opponents to Thieu in an election in Vietnam. It was an operation of terror in Vietnam, and I don't see much difference between the legal criminal mind that conducts warfare, that makes napalm, that makes chemicals, the kind that we've revealed this week that the Pentagon does, where they're overdosed acid, 1,600 milligrams instead of 160 or whatever. Killing is killing, and there's degrees, whether it's 40,000, like William Colby claimed that he was capable of doing or acknowledging, or 7 in the case down at the Sharon Tate home and LaBianca homes. Murders are murders, and it's a degree of numbers. And I listened to Sandra Good very carefully, and she listened to me, and she will be a guest, hopefully, come down on the peninsula and talk. And before I do more of the discussion I had with her, the areas we agreed and the areas where we disagreed, there were a few things I did want to bring up first for the first 5 minutes. The first point is that Gerald Ford is visiting our area. He's coming to Monterey to Pebble Beach on the 20th, September the 20th. Mr. Ford is a very busy man. He went to Europe. He came home. He built himself a $100,000 swimming pool, but he seems to not be in Washington for the summer to use it. He's out in Colorado. He's in Sacramento, all over the country. And then he's in Dallas, Texas, where he lets out an interview at the time with the newsmen in Dallas this last week that he hadn't thought about the John Kennedy assassination. They asked him about it when he flew into Dallas, and he said it hadn't even gone through his mind when he went into Dallas. That is really very hard to believe, particularly since he was a member of the Warren Commission, and he flew into Dallas to meet with Jack Ruby, and Jack Ruby begged to tell him about the conspiracy that was taking place, and Gerald Ford wouldn't let him tell, and he left, and Jack Ruby was killed. And it was in that city that he said the country isn't going to pot. This is Gerald Ford's quotation. "I did not take a sacred oath of office to preside over the decline and fall of the United States of America." Well, that may be true. I think he took the sacred oath of office in order to continue hiding the truth about the murder of John Kennedy, which he announced in Dallas again, and he does publicly. He does not intend to investigate. Now, I knew that President Ford, Gerald Ford, would be on the coast soon, and I did want to mention a brief episode that occurred in the college class which we gave last year. I gave an English class with Ray Fabrizio at Monterey Peninsula College, and at the time there was a student attending the class who was particularly anxious about Lee Harvey Oswald, and within one lecture he wanted to know every detail, and it seemed that he was so much more knowledgeable than many persons that have studied the Warren Commission hearings for years, and his manner was such that he seemed like a disturbed person who identified with Oswald, who almost thought he was Oswald, who said he wanted to feel what it was like to be Oswald. And I was very concerned about details of this case, which I will not go into on the air, and I called the FBI here in Monterey, California, and said, in the event that Gerald Ford comes to this peninsula, because I know he's going to come here, he has close friends here, and this is Reagan territory, also very heavily Reagan territory, and members, people involved in Richard Nixon's campaign and in CREEP are very heavily embedded into the Pebble Beach vicinity. And I said, in the event that Gerald Ford comes here and would be assassinated on this peninsula, I want the record to show that this particular person was not influenced by the course given at Monterey Peninsula College. Because the very first year the course was given, there was some question. One of the professor's objections was that Mae Brussell is very impressionable, or maybe she's a Pied Piper, or she might influence these young minds. And I remembered that because it stuck in my head, because all I ever tried to do on the radio and in college courses and in public lectures is to give sources of information and data that you can look up for yourselves, not to believe me, but to do your own research and become researchers yourself. So it was interesting that the second year that this course was given, this man identified so much with Oswald. And I did some investigative work. The faculty did some work. We had a meeting. My worst fears about the background of the situation were interesting. As I said, I don't want to share them on the air now. All I want to say is that I did notify the FBI that I would not be a fall guy. I would not be like a Manson influencing students in the event that President Ford were on this peninsula and were assassinated, or an assassination attempt were ever made. I don't want to say it was a student at our class. And I bring this up because he will be here on the 20th. And I did the same kind of a radio program last year when I was at San Jose, when Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford were there, and alerted certain persons because I heard that the military was planning a martial law to come down, and I called the Presidio of the spy school here, and I called Fort Ord, and at the time certain students were told either to go along with the plan or resign from the Army immediately. And I called certain officers and checked that out and found out that there were equal troop movements taking place at the East Coast at the same time. And now an article is coming out in Playboy, November Playboy, by Ted Salk, telling about the martial law plan, the Garden Plot, that involved Ronald Reagan, that involved a plan from 1969 to through the early 70s of a martial law plan in California. And this is what I was talking about. And I feel there's safety in talking it on the air and calling the military heads and calling the FBI and notifying them in advance that you're aware of the potential of their plans and having it heavily documented, and in that way maybe prevent them at that particular time from trying to pull what they would want to get off. There's every reason in the world to push some kind of an assassination plot against Gerald Ford at this time, or even Vice President Rockefeller. And I've talked about the power struggle many times, but I just, at this particular program, want to mention that he's coming, and that I have always feared that when he came here, that we researchers on the peninsula could be used as patsies. And I want the record to stand that in the event something happened, we refuse to take the responsibility for it. The crime bill, the Senate crime bill that is so dangerous to researchers, people that have exposed the CIA and the Pentagon, is working its way now into the House, and some of the senators are backing down. I think you should write to New York City to a gentleman named Lindsay Auden, Audin, Lindsay Auden, 169 Main Street, Ossining, Ossining, New York, 10562. Write to Lindsay, and for 50 cents, he will send you a book on the emerging police state. For 25 cents, he'll give you a list of 32 organizations that you can get more information from. And if you send him $5, he'll give you an analysis of the LEAA and problems of nuclear power and design for a free society, and help you to fight that terrible crime bill that is working its way through the Senate and into the House. Many people have suspected Daniel Ellsberg of being an agent provocateur and working for the other side, in spite of the fact that the Pentagon Papers was revealed. Many researchers do claim that he has worked for the other side, and the purpose would be by leaking certain papers on the Pentagon which did not actually affect the Nixon administration or the Pentagon particularly. It would require not only the set of the plumbers that Nixon could use for political purposes later, as an excuse to stop leaks, but then it could be used for harsh laws because so many researchers are working on the John Kennedy assassination, the Robert Kennedy assassination, and just like the Rosenberg family asking for the papers about their parents' death and Alger Hiss getting his papers. Any leaks that these papers exist would give stiff penalties to newsmen, to private investigators, for people in the agency. So in order to stop research and investigation, the best way is to pass a law of $10,000 or 10 years in jail, and it's similar to the Russian system of sending you to Siberia. So get informed on this and write to the congressmen who are faltering now on this, who were sure of themselves before, and write to Lindsay Auden. Write to him in New York, and he will give you this information. 169 Main Street, Hustling, New York, 10562. Senator John Tunney sent a letter to various persons in California, a questionnaire to be answered on different problems in the United States Senate. There's a series of questions, about 20 questions, which I answered and mailed to him. And then the last question is this one. He says, one last but very important question. If you could enact a law, what would it do? And I think that's a good question because a lot of congressmen like to enact a law and get their name on the book. And so from the standpoint of a researcher, this is what I answered to him. And you may write to Senator Tunney and say, if you want a new law, this is the most important law in the land that I can see. I said, Dear Senator Tunney, you asked if you could enact a law, what would it do? And my answer to that question is based on 13 years of research into political assassinations. The law that I would make is that from the moment a person is a suspect in any criminal case, federal or state, it does not matter, and if that person is indicted or if that person is convicted, all evidence pertaining to these cases, physical, as well as the records, the autopsy records, the medical records, the interviews, the police records, the guns, the physical evidence like ceiling panels in the Ambassador Hotel, coats and jackets, should not be destroyed or altered or found missing. The penalty for the handling of this evidence, whether it is a secretary such as Sally Harmony working for the Committee to Re-elect the President, or Rosemary Wood working for Richard Nixon, or Richard Helms admitting he destroyed CIA documents on conspiracies and drugs, or Mr. Lee Pennington, who went to James McCord's home after the Watergate arrests, those penalties should be 10 years in jail and a $10,000 fine. Just a flat fee, a flat sentence with no immunity. In other words, they can't say these things exist, but I didn't know about them. Or I destroyed them, but Mr. Helms didn't give me the orders. Or I went to the house on my own. Whoever takes things such as opening up the safe of E. Howard Hunt and a trailer pulls up at the White House and removes boxes, Patrick Gray takes information and John Ehrlichman tells him to de-six it, throw it in the river, and he burns it in his fireplace. Gray should go to jail just like any other prisoner on the street, whether you're dealing dope or not. The penalty for any person who destroys or alters or handles any evidence in any criminal matter, in a murder or in an arrest matter, whether it's C. Arnold Smith down in Los Angeles, bankers, whatever, whenever they're arrested, indicted, and tried, all evidence should be maintained and not destroyed. I wrote to him and said that as soon as people were arrested at the Watergate, the creep records were put into shredding machines. As soon as it was revealed that the CIA gave LSD and serious drugs to unsuspecting citizens, all records were destroyed. As soon as John Kennedy was murdered, his car interior was sent to Michigan and destroyed. That interior would tell us what direction bullets came from, how many were fired, the distance that they were fired, and the type of bullets that were used. I added in the letter that 35 pieces of evidence relating to the John Kennedy assassination were destroyed or locked up within 1 week after the time that John Kennedy was killed. You read this week in the paper that all the Chappaquiddick records of Mary Jo Kopechne's death have been destroyed. The chief of police took them home, didn't make copies, and then returned it with copies, and they're missing. I add in the letter, the most important thing for America today is to halt these criminal conspiracies. The most important way of solving crimes is by examining the evidence. The most important fact is that the evidence has been consistently removed, destroyed, locked up, and altered. And this kind of action makes us unable to solve the crimes. You can't solve the crimes on witness testimony because witnesses can be offered parole, witnesses can be given bribes, they can be given false identities and a lifetime pension. It is the evidence, the bullets, the clothing, the autopsies, the cars, the street signs, the diaries, it's the documents, the letters, the actual handwriting, the ordering of the guns, checking it with the ownership. This is the kind of evidence that is missing in every one of these cases, and this is why some fools keep talking about conspiracy theories in the editorials. Talk about conspiracy theories. There are no theories, there are conspiracies, and the necessity to destroy the evidence feeds this story that they're conspiracy theories where they're actually conspiracies. And now we get to the news a little bit about Squeaky. Lynette Fromm, the Sacramento Bee, had an article this last Wednesday about Harold Borough. The great cover story in this is that he was her sugar daddy. It's very interesting that this older man, the sugar daddy for the Manson family, provides Cadillac, provides a Volkswagen, provides a gun that's going to be 2 feet from the President of the United States. And where did sugar daddy come from? He worked at McClellan Air Force Base from 1941 until his retirement, June 29, 1973. And furthermore, there's evidence that he has funded them before. Now, Jack Anderson, who I had said over and over again, works for the Defense Intelligence Agency, who puts down conspiracies but always takes the Pentagon side on these stories. Jack Anderson wrote an article saying that Ms. Fromm used her feminine wiles to wheedle favors from Borough, who just happened to work at McClellan Air Force Base for all of those years. These same feminine wiles got her a safe house at the Spahn Ranch, which I said 3-4 years ago as a safe house for the Manson family. There, an elderly man who was almost blind was allegedly seduced by Squeaky, and 18 and more people could live there comfortably and have some nice summer in Malibu at the Spahn Ranch, which was procured by the same Squeaky through the same female personality, rent-free, loving this old blind man. And now we read in the Sacramento Bee and from the Washington Post that this money that came to them has been coming for quite a long time from little sugar daddy, that they picked up money for the Manson family, that Manson's been corresponding to a post office box of somebody by the name of Borough, a female, and there is no person by that name, but the same man's name is Borough. And it's interesting because I allege that when Manson left the prison down near San Diego and shared a cell with Alvin Creepy Karpis, who was J. Edgar Hoover's old pal, he went to Sacramento, and somewhere in Sacramento the bread was provided for that bus, for the stereo set, for the chicks, for the grand tour through the Southwest, and to the safe house at the Spahn Ranch. And all of a sudden in 1975 and September 75, they use the word sugar daddy. There's more than a sugar daddy involved in the Manson story. It's an outrage of domestic Cold War. Sandra Good was telling me Manson can't be used. I took a tape of some of our phone conversations. She said, Charlie Manson can't be used by anybody. I said, Charlie Manson can't select his cellmate either. There's only the limits that a man can do, even with Manson's intellect. And if he were Jesus Christ, which he claims he is, and if he's Wilhelm Reich and Gandhi and all those great thinkers rolled into one, then why couldn't there be a conspiracy against Charlie Manson? Because there was a conspiracy to murder all those other people. Wilhelm Reich was murdered in a federal penitentiary, and Gandhi was shot, and Jesus was crucified. And if you think Manson has those godlike qualities, then why can't he be framed just like the others, and why can't he be used, and how does he end up with creepy carpets, and where do you find people from McClellan Air Force Base and call them your sugar daddies, and where do you find ranches where a group of motley people like that can live and spend their summers in the sun and raise their family and babies and plan their little trip into Beverly Hills where these murders were later to happen. And I told her about a person in my college class who spoke up one day, and if any of you remember him, or if he's listening, or if he's still in town, because I lost track of him, and he promised to come to the house. He had a roommate who was from military intelligence. His father works at the Pentagon. And this roommate was dressed like a hippie, looked like a hippie, and he was at the Spahn Ranch all the time with Charlie Manson and the girls out there near Calabasas in California. And one day he said to this fellow who was attending my college course, in which I talked about the Manson family as being a military operation, he went to his friend and he said, "I'm splitting tonight, I've got to go." And he didn't tell him why. And he said, I'm just leaving. And he packed up his things. And that was the night that Sharon Tate and 5 other people were murdered in the house. And this fellow went on, and later the 2 friends corresponded, and the person who was attending the class told me that person's father works in Washington, works in the Pentagon, and that his son, the roommate who split the night of those murders, was in Colorado in military intelligence. And he felt, after he heard me and I talked about the case, that there was military intelligence involved in the Sharon Tate LaBianca murders. And when I talked to Sandra Good, she kept trying to say that Manson is his own boss, that Manson is his own God, that he has his own head. But then I asked her the question, even if he is, it's all the more reason to infiltrate him and discredit him. If he's all that you say he is, and the media has created this monster, which is easy to believe because I've been sympathetic to the Manson story right from the beginning. As I say, not the killings, but to the insidious infiltration of it by the military intelligence. And I said, when I find this person, and he will show up again, I will introduce him to you, and you will recognize him. And some part of those murders, you were helped along or given the acid and the encouragement. If you're on 1,000 acid trips, believe me, somewhere the government came in and supplied something that made you kids go bananas and do the things that you did. Another point we brought up was in the news this week, Senator Church's committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence, found out about the use of shellfish poison that the CIA laboratory has. And Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the same person that was using LSD experiments in the 70s, and again, this goes back to the violences in California, admitted that they used these poisons, operational poisons, and they had a supply of cobra venom, and they used shellfish poison. And one point they made in the article, this is a story coming out from the Washington Post and the New York Times on the poisons, said that they used it to silence dogs at embassies, to enable dogs at foreign embassies, and not to kill them, but to silence dogs, that they used these poisons as an aggressive action. And that rang something in my mind. My head again began to spin because there were unanswered questions to many of these conspiracies. I have many of the answers and some I don't have. One of the things that happened at the time that General Walker was shot in Texas, shortly before the assassination of John Kennedy, General Walker was sitting at his window in April '63, and he was shot. There was no intention to kill him. It was a spring evening. The light was on. The window was open, but a bullet went in the bookcase. And later, it was to be used as a cover story to link Lee Harvey Oswald to the shooting of Walker. But the neighbor and the witnesses had seen a car with 2 people come up to that house and leave that night, and believed that the person, the getaway and so forth, was in a car, which Lee Harvey Oswald didn't drive. And the bullets in Walker's home couldn't be positively identified to any weapon allegedly owned by Lee Harvey Oswald. But one of the things that confused the neighbor was that the night of the action, they had a dog that always barked when somebody came up to those homes that didn't bark that night, and their dog was silent. And then I thought again of the Sharon Tate murder, where there was these people, 6 people in a home, There was another fellow in the guest house nearby who had just had a guest leaving, who was sitting in a car, and he was shot. And there were these Weimar dogs, these Warts dogs, several of them. And one of the big mysteries, and after the cables were cut and the telephone power lines were cut, why didn't the dogs bark? The dogs weren't killed, and the dogs never barked. And that was one of the big mysteries in my head in '67. So you see, in 1975, the CIA comes out and tells you that they're using poisons to give dogs, watchdogs, that they don't bark. So then we have to go back again and say, if Dr. Gottlieb was making these venoms and poisons through this time period and working with these agents, and if these were military operations, how many dogs were given this kind of medicine? Were they all embassy dogs, or did the dog next door to General Walker get silenced for the same reason? Or did the dogs at Sharon Tate's house get silenced for the same reason? Everything comes together if you give yourself enough time. I've been doing this for 13 years, and the pieces are coming together. These deadly toxins have been kept against the orders of the government, against the orders of the President of the United States. And in today's New York Times, Tom Wicker, this says it's a Frankenstein monster. He has an article that says, "Time to disband the super-secret CIA." The disclosure that the Central Intelligence Agency hoarded a supply of deadly poisons in direct contradiction and contravention of President Richard Nixon's order destroyed in '69 is only one more bit of evidence that the agency is a Frankenstein monster that itself must be destroyed. Such secret power is intolerable in an open democratic society. Just as the CIA covert techniques came to be employed in domestic politics by the White House plumbers under E. Howard Hunt, so it is more dangerous the tactics and the attitudes spawned in this dark atmosphere of anything-goes operation of waging secret wars in the name of national security and contaminating us with these germs. Tom Wicker of the New York Times says it's time to disband the secret CIA. In the news also, Mr. Schweiker, Senator Richard Schweiker, is arguing that the Senate Select Committee should investigate the assassination of John Kennedy. And meanwhile, John Tower and Senator Frank Church say, no, we won't investigate it. Along lines of conspiracy, I'm going through a few events in the news because they all link all back to a chain of command, maybe 40 or 50 people whose names I mentioned in Boston. I mentioned them on the air all the time. They're all linked together, and the chickens are coming home to roost. And it would take something like an assassination to divert us from all this information coming out. For example, there's an article in the paper this week from the New York Times that there's a third man in the kidnapping of Samuel Brofman in New York. Now, you remember Edgar Brofman paid $2.3 million ransom to kidnappers of his son, to get his son back, and then they got the money back after the kidnapping. The boy said there was a third person involved. There was also a third person watching in New Jersey at the airport, waiting for the money to be delivered. They've established that a third person was waiting for this money. Now, two men were arrested. Two men were arrested for the kidnapping, but three were involved. Does that sound like the SLA? Do you see the comparison, the patterns? They could say three people kidnapped Patty Hearst, but they never found the third person, never looked for the third person, no charges, no FBI reports. They're not on the list of the 10 most wanted. And then to make it more shocking, another article came out by Samuel Brofman II. The attorney for Dominic Byrne, one of the men who kidnapped him, said in court that his client offered Seagram liquor heir Samuel Brofman his freedom, but Brofman refused to leave the apartment he was being held in. He could have his freedom, but for reasons that will be made clear later, he chose not to take advantage of the offer. Now, I think that the Brofman kidnapping came at a time when the FBI is looking ridiculous, and when a series of kidnappings were planned anyway to escalate the fear, to make the headlines of Newsweek and Time. What is happening to America with all these kidnappings? We have to increase private police force. We have to increase the FBI budget. What will we do about this terror in America? So they took this Samuel Brofman, who obviously knew his two kidnappers. He seemed to know them or gone to bars with them. The third person was let off. He could have been left off. They carried this little facade which only made the FBI look great because they captured their man. His father coughed up the $2.3 million one day. The next day it's delivered, and the daddy gets married, and they have a big party. But who pays the FBI? How much early Cronkite news, the 6 o'clock news, the 6:30 news, the 7, the major media, shoving down our throat these kidnapping stories, the threatening, the terror in America, like the Hearst case, when everything indicates that they not only don't investigate the people involved, the people who set it up, they get off. The other people get off, the case is closed, and we end up with more police and more headlines and more statistics. Now I'm going to switch to the Howard Hughes story. I think that a lot of what's happening is a diversionary from that great big Hughes story, because we have until next week for Howard Hughes to appear. It's September the 17th. He's supposed to appear in New York City and Manhattan and put his fingerprints down on the line. So there was an article this last week by Leonard Putney, Pountney, who says that you won't know when you see him. He's supposed to be a British makeup expert who says he's made many faces for him and hairdos so that even his own ex-wife won't recognize him. He says, my most amazing client is so disguised that he walks around London, or did, and nobody would know him with mustaches and wigs and false eyebrows and nose plugs and so forth. And he has a story of making him walk around the supermarkets in London, and when you bump into him, you wouldn't know him. And this is just another kind of disguise for that double if he appears. And how the fingerprint report comes out will be interesting, but we do have the Howard Hughes story coming up, and we'll be watching it anxiously in the next few weeks. Also, the zebra trials going on in San Francisco, and I said a year ago, December, the zebra trial preceded, the zebra killings preceded the SLA. It was the beginning of the Phoenix operation in America. It was an overblown story. It was the beginning of encouraging racism and passes for black people in town and stopping black people. The main witness of the zebra trial, Anthony Cornelius Harris, is falling apart. He's beginning to squeal. He claims that the FBI and the police have offered him, he's a former convict, they've offered him a new birth certificate, new military discharge papers, a high school diploma, and some money. And he's supposed to be in Houston, Texas, with his new identity, and he's cracking up because they're not giving him the amount of money they promised him. So the taxpayer has to keep paying him in order to prosecute a few black people in San Francisco. Will be paying Anthony Cornelia Harris for the rest of his life, and somebody's going to hire him and not know that he's simply a California ex-convict snitch, and he's going to have a refined high school degree and military diploma and a new name, and he's being made very respectable. And the city that he's living in is Houston, Texas. Now, when George Jackson was killed, the day that George Jackson was killed up at San Quentin, a female brought a tape recording machine which was given to another person who disappeared totally from the scene and was never, the police say they want him, he's supposed to be living in Canada, these mysterious parties, but the agent that handed the tape recording machine, she went to Houston, Texas, and she lives there, and that's a good place to hide. Thera Wheeler of the SLA, who was supposed to originally been in on the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, but who, in quotes, escaped from Vacaville, who knew Donald DeFreeze, who's brothers with the San Francisco Police Department, escaped and went to Houston, Texas, and he is protected in Houston, Texas, which is the funding of all the major conspiracies and assassinations from Dallas through Watergate. And now we find that the American violence syndrome, the agent provocateur in the George Jackson shootout at San Quentin, flees to Houston. The major witness in the zebra trial, he's in Houston. An important major witness in the SLA is in Houston. The pattern keeps repeating itself, and you can cross-file these cities. And I think it's an interesting thing, considering that the Houston money was what broke the Watergate story, being washed from Mexico to Houston to Washington to Bernard Barker's bank. And Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend, George de Mohrenschildt, always went to Houston for his assignments and his money when he worked for the CIA. And the Houston funding, the connections there to the conspiracies is important. Also, Charles Watson, who did all of the murders in the Sharon Tate home, and then with Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca the night before, fled the Manson family and went to Texas and was protected by the judges and courts until he could have his separate trial, and he fled to Texas. And it was Louis Tackwood, the agent provocateur of the Los Angeles Police Department, who said that there was a link from New Orleans to Houston, Texas, to Los Angeles Police Department and the CIA up and down the state of California. And there were tight links to Santa Cruz, Marin County, and the San Quentin shootout, the Marin shootout, and many of the violences and criminal conspiracies that were happening. The headquarters of the forming of the SLA came from the LAPD. And Tackwood talks about Houston, Texas, in the Glass House tapes. He mentions Houston. So as the Zebra trials go on in San Francisco, that overblown racist attempt to hurry up the race war, Mr. Anthony Cornelia Harris is now asking for his more money, $600 a month or whatever, and he has his family and he'll get his degrees and lots of luck. But I don't think a snitch like that will have much luck along the way. I think he'll be in trouble, because how long can you keep running and people will find you and find out who you are and know you for what you are? Well, there were so many things in the news having to do with conspiracies that I kind of wandered here. I have many notes about Gerald Ford being in California last week and the attempt on him. And within the next 3 or 4 minutes, I'll just run down a few of the points. Again, some of them I made last week, but to just reaffirm what I think happened. In the first place, as I say, Governor Brown had turned down $86 million of the LEAA money. LEAA is CIA domestic money. He wanted to find out where all this money was going, and Gerald Ford was out here to make an appeal to the Assembly to accept military hardware for our police department. And the second point is that Charles Manson had just gone to court to appeal his conviction based on over 49 new motions, and I can't believe that these girls, Squeaky or Miss Good, or people that really love Manson, would help Manson's case by pretending they want to kill the president. Her defense now is, I didn't want to kill Gerald Ford, I just want to call attention to get Manson out of jail. The very hardest way to get out of jail is to have friends like that who hold a gun 2 feet away from the President of the United States. I hope if ever I'm in jail on some charge that my friends don't try to commit a murder in order to get me out of jail. I can't believe that's the way you do it. Third point, I think, is that Gerald Ford acted totally abnormal under the situations. He met with the governor of California after the so-called assassination attempt for 45 minutes and never even mentioned there was an attempt on his life. Either his head is of silicon or something is wrong in his brain, or it was a fake provocation to call attention to him, to divert from other matters, or to prepare us for the real assassination to happen, because there's no way that you could talk to the Assembly, talk to these people, and give a speech about crime, coincidentally about crime, and about criminals being on the street that belong in prison, where a person has been charged twice with murder and she's 2 feet from you, and not say to the men in front of you, oh, pardon me, but isn't it a coincidence that my speech talked about 10th Street, and a few minutes ago when I crossed 10th Street, somebody tried to kill me? It is out of the realm of possibility that a man could be that calm that he wouldn't share with the governor of this state that an alleged assassin was on the Capitol grounds, even for the protection of the governor, if not for himself. Now, the chief of police, Ed Davis, in Los Angeles, has been crying over again the cause of conspiracies, and the cause of the violence is women. So wasn't it coincidental that Ed Davis, who's been named in the Glass House tapes and all kinds of allegations of concealing the Robert Kennedy assassination and various California conspiracies, should have a woman so-called assassin on the cover of Time and Newsweek and in the news media 2 weeks after his speech to reaffirm what he told the policemen in the East? The whole thing seems of a criminal conspiracy section cover story. Not that the assassination can't come off and won't come off, but there were so many abnormal things about the location of this woman, of her being at the Associated Press a month before, of her funding from her sugar daddy who worked for the military for 30 years. The Manson story is a disgrace. It should be exposed. It should be exposed in conjunction with all the assassinations. And until it is, we'll continue to have these jumbled conspiracy stories consuming our time and interest. Time is over 1 minute again. I apologize. I'll see you next week on KLRB, and take care of yourselves.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.